Welcome to the Good Fit Careers podcast, where we explore perspectives on work that fits. I'm Ryan Dickerson, your host. Today's guest is Vichi Jagannathan. Vichi is the co-founder and co-CEO of the Rural Opportunity Institute in North Carolina. ROI is a startup nonprofit that has trained over 15,000 people in trauma-informed practices in North Carolina and has partnered with more than 20 groups like schools, police departments, social services organizations, and community nonprofits to implement those best practices throughout the state. Vichi started her career as a high school science teacher with Teach for America after completing a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering at Princeton and a master's degree in electrical engineering at Stanford. After her Teach for America rotation, Vichi joined Microsoft as a regional director of the TEALS program, focused on teaching computer science in high schools. After Microsoft, Vichi earned her MBA at Yale. In 2017, Vichi and her co-founder started the Rural Opportunity Institute. Thank you so much for being here. Would you give us an understanding of the work that you do today to get us started, please?
Yeah, so currently I am the co-founder of a startup nonprofit called Rural Opportunity Institute, and we are operating in a pretty rural part of northeastern North Carolina around helping communities and community organizations become more trauma informed. And so basically what that looks like is working with them to shift from working with institutions like police or schools or health departments to shift from more traditional practices that might feel punitive to people to instead responding with more restorative responses, especially when people are coming in with like high stress, mental health challenges, that type of thing.
Can you give us a kind of a simplified description of kind of the goal or like what you're really trying to accomplish for the people in rural North Carolina?
Yeah, I think the ultimate goal of ROI is oftentimes people experience hard things in life. It might be out of your control, things like homelessness or a hurricane or losing your job. And right now, a lot of times when that happens, it sets off a kind of endless spiral for people where they're not really able to recover. And our goal is to strengthen the different community and public agencies around people, especially in rural communities, so that when those hard things happen, they're surrounded by support and they're able to quickly recover, get back on their feet, and get back on track with what they were doing before that happened.
Oh, that's wonderful. Would you help us build our frame of reference and our understanding of you as a person and how you came to be? And would you indulge us a little bit and tell us about what you were like as a kid?
Sure. Yeah, it's kind of funny to think about. Definitely when I was a kid, I don't think I would have imagined doing nonprofit work. So I grew up just outside New York City. Both my parents were IBM engineers and scientists. So what I remember most as a little kid is they were coming home with chemistry sets and old computer chips and stuff like that and doing a lot of tinkering. So I was always like mixing stuff together. I had a little toy, like a play kitchen, and I'd be like pretending to mix stuff up and heat it up and things like that. So I guess I was always kind of curious and somewhat willing to get my hands dirty in terms of like trying out solutions and building things and things like that. But I think I ran through a bunch of possible careers when I was little, but I wanted to be a waitress because they made a lot of tips. So now I better understand that whole ecosystem. I think there was a part when I wanted to be a marine biologist and then a journalist and a bunch of different things. So I had a lot of interests, but I think, yeah, just very curious.
Right on. And what did you imagine, in terms of your educational career path? Did you have a sense of what you wanted to study from early in life?
I don't think I did early in life. I mean, I had a couple of influences around me. So both my parents had PhDs and did research before transitioning into their careers. And so I think there was a part of me that understood that research world and was interested in that. But I guess the one thing that I always got hung up on, and I guess it's kind of played out, is I was really interested in the practical applications. Like if we were doing something, I wanted to see people use it, or I wanted to build something, or I wanted to be able to like watch it work in front of me, which I guess eventually led me to think about engineering. But that wasn't, I think growing up, I was pretty open to understanding what could be out there. I did have a small time period when I wanted to be a professional basketball player. So I did that also.
Oh.
I had that phase.
Wow. We all can dream.
Yeah. So I was very open. I don't think I was like some kids, they're 5 years old and they say, I'm going to be this, and they do it. I was never really like that. It's like every year, if you asked me, I probably had a different thing that I said I wanted to do.
Yeah, that makes sense. And such an interesting winding road, that we all tend to follow to land where we're supposed to be. Your educational pedigree, I would say, is top of the world. Perhaps one of the most impressive educational backgrounds I've ever seen. Princeton and Stanford and then Yale. Tell me a little bit about, like, was that the plan? Was that what you expected your education to be like? And what was that experience actually like for you?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, that set of universities altogether was definitely not the plan. But like I said, I think I was surrounded by some influences that made that feel like safe, a safe path. So both my parents, like I said before, they have PhDs. Both my parents have PhDs. They also immigrated from India and so studied in India. And they would always tell us growing up that they wished they could have studied at a lot of the US universities. And, they were naming the Harvards and Princetons and Yales and all that stuff. So I think I had that around me a lot growing up. And so when it came time to think about school and college, those types of big research universities were definitely on my radar. I don't think I thought I'd hit three of them.
Yeah.
That came later, but kind of had that on my radar. And then when I was later in college, my older sister actually went to MIT. And so she also had a lot of experience with the process and how she had navigated that. So got a lot of guidance from her. So I think in general, this idea of like higher education, some of these universities, that was in my head. The part that was less clear was how does that turn into a career path? And I don't think we didn't really have that conversation much growing up. So that was the part that I kind of had to like figure out on my own.
For the people out there who perhaps haven't had the opportunity to attend schools like that, could you tell us a little bit about what your experience was like and maybe some of your favorite or the most valuable components of that kind of education?
Yeah, I think attending a very elite university, it has its pros and cons. So I think in terms of what it was like, prior to that I went to a really big public school. Like my graduating class was about 550. And it was a good public school, but the whole wide range of types of offerings and people that are there and there wasn't really like one thing that they're pushing you to do, which I loved. And I think the difference going to a place like Princeton, that's where I went to first, there is a lot more funneling towards certain very high profile career paths. And a lot of them I hadn't even heard of. So it was interesting, like going in freshman year, people are already talking about, I'm going to do consulting, or are you going to do finance or consulting or grad school? That's like the 30 things people talk about. And I didn't know anybody in finance or consulting. And my parents went to grad school. So to me, it was like, there's not that many choices. You kind of pick your lane. You're going really hard to that. There's a ton of support for the one that you pick. And that was great. Like I got a lot of support to think about grad school and things like that. But the part that I didn't really get was exposure. And I didn't really realize until much later in my career that there's all these other things you can do besides, well, I guess besides law school, med school, finance, consulting, and grad school. So, pros and cons. I think in terms of like favorite part, the quality of the teaching wasn't always super high, but it is something else having the person teaching your course or lecture win a Nobel Prize. And that is something that was wild. Like I am lucky enough to have had at least two professors who were Nobel Prize winners. Like I said, not always highest quality in terms of teaching the material, but just it's pretty like miraculous to be in proximity to people like that and go to their office hours and they're making jokes and they're fairly normal people. That's probably one of the experiences I most take away or remember, was just like how cool it was to actually be physically in those spaces.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. So let's transition from your educational experience over into your first full-time job. And if I'm reading your resume right, it sounds like you did some school and then some work and then back to school and then back to work. Can you bring us along in that journey?
Yeah. It was actually a little while before I got my first full-time job. So I did my undergrad in engineering, electrical engineering, and then I graduated in 2010 and was very interested in working at that point and applied to a lot of tech jobs. Again, I didn't have a lot of guidance around the range of things I could be applying to. So I think that was a factor. But I was applying to a lot of just, tech companies to be an engineer. And because of the recession and the 2008 financial crisis, many of them mid-process were coming back to me saying they had a hiring freeze. So I was hitting a lot of dead ends, and it was getting pretty close to senior year, graduation. Like, people were lining up their stuff. So at that point, I decided to also apply to grad school. And when push came to shove at the end, that was the only offer I had, was to go to grad school. So that's what I ended up doing right out of school, was starting a PhD program. But even when I was there, I was pretty sure that probably wasn't what I wanted to end up doing, but I was hoping it would give me more time. And around that same time, I encountered a Teach for America recruiter. And I think if you look back in time, that 2010-ish period was like the height of TFA. A lot of people doing it, very highly regarded. And so I met a recruiter. They were very convincing. So I decided to submit an application to that as well. I also am not sure that I really thought I would do it, but at that point, it was like I was just trying to get options, and ended up getting into TFA. So at the time, I had this choice between doing a PhD at Stanford or starting Teach for America. I visited Stanford. I had never been to California before. It was just so cool. So I was having a hard time turning it down. And so I called up Teach for America, and I'm like, look, I have this other opportunity. And they were very understanding. They were like, that's fine. Why don't you try grad school, and you can defer. You can defer going to Teach for America. It would strengthen your teaching experience if you had this grad school experience. So give it a go for a year and then call us back. So that felt very safe. So I went to Stanford for a year, loved California, loved studying on a campus that felt like paradise, did not feel super welcomed within electrical engineering there. It's still pretty tough, but I think at the time it was a big class. So my cohort was about 1,000 students, and it was like over 90% men. So just very few women. And that was within the student body, but also reflected in the faculty. So encountered a lot of, I think you'd call them like microaggressions at this point, but small examples of toxicity. I didn't have the words for it. I don't think I consciously realized that, but it just over time it wore on me. And I felt like, I don't think this is what I want to be doing for like 5 or more years. So built a lot of confidence in that. So I ended up calling TFA back and saying, hey, yeah, what do you got? And so they offered me a placement in Eastern North Carolina, which I had never been to North Carolina, didn't know anything about it, but sounded good to me, and took that offer. So I left Stanford, packed up all my stuff, drove cross country, came to North Carolina. So my first job was a high school teacher in rural Eastern North Carolina.
Well, that's wonderful. And I mean, such an important and valuable thing. And what a great opportunity for a lot of those students to, get to learn from someone like you. What was your experience as a high school teacher like?
Man, teaching high school couldn't be further from doing your PhD in electrical engineering. It was super, super challenging and different. And especially so I was teaching in a rural region. Most TFA placements are urban. So in our case, it was like I was living in a town, I guess even a county of probably less than 10,000. The town I was in had about 700 people. The school I was in they graduated about 30 to 50 students a year. So very, very small compared to where I'd grown up. I was on a hallway teaching where almost everybody was a TFA teacher. So there was like 8 to 10 of us on one hall just teaching the same kids. So it was an interesting, like intense bonding growth experience. I lived in a house with 6 teachers. We were the majority of young professionals our age in the area. So we built this really strong support network. A lot of my co-founder today did TFA. The other organization I started, she also did TFA. A bunch of my best friends now did TFA. So we got really close friendship wise. I think the hard part was teaching is a really hard job. And then teaching in a rural, low resource environment is really hard. Teaching in a community that you're not from is really hard. So it was like a fire hose of learning not just how to do the job, but also learning a ton about myself. I hadn't really been in a situation where I'm constantly speaking in front of people and interacting with people. And it's like, you're coming in every day, entertaining 20 to 30 high school students, and you got to come up with, how to engage them and do this stuff. You're the one adult in the room. And so I grew a lot in terms of like finding my own voice, understanding my identity, building relationships, getting comfortable with failing really hard and then coming back the next day. So yeah, just like a ton of growth, particularly in skills that I had never really practiced before. So I think that ended up being very positive.
So it sounds like the circumstance itself, the place that you were doing the teaching was challenging. Your audience, the people that you were teaching specifically, was challenging, and then also making that transition yourself, going from being the student to being the teacher. Would you share, on any of those categories, what specifically was so hard about any of those?
I would say probably one of the harder parts was actually the teaching. And I think something that's especially hard about it is that you have to be on every single day. And so I just remember, like, you come in on Monday morning, you got 3 classes to teach. Every single one of those classes is a very large, like, if you imagine you're in a job and you have to facilitate a 90-minute meeting, there's at least that amount of time of prep that goes into it. And so you've spent, for me, so if inefficient the first time, maybe I've spent 4 hours prepping for that 90-minute lesson that I need to do 3 times. And then you go and do it and it doesn't go so well. And it's like, okay, then I spent a lot of time re-explaining everything because the kids were confused and they didn't learn anything. And then I'm like, oh, never mind. Sorry. Like, that was poorly thought out. And then you go home and you're like, man, that was rough. And guess what? You need to put in 4 more hours to wake up tomorrow and run it back. And it's the same people in the room who remembered that you confused them yesterday. And you're like, okay, it's like you're doing that every single day, day in and day out. I mean, the cool part is over time, you get better fast, you build relationships, confidence, all that stuff. But I remember the first month or 2, it was like from 6 a.m. to 10 or 11 p.m., I was constantly working. Like, I was either, preparing for a lesson, teaching a lesson, prepping for the next day. It just was like, I remember feeling like I couldn't spare a single second. And you're just like, if I spend a single second doing something else, I'm not going to stay on the treadmill, because the class comes whether you're ready or not. And the less ready you are, the worse it goes. So it's like, yeah, it was just a really rough getting a hang of things in the beginning. I mean, eventually you develop a system. It gets a lot easier. Like, by the end of my second year, it was way smoother. Like, I could spend a Sunday planning the whole week, and I wasn't, I'd leave work at 3, do a couple hours of work. I could do stuff in the evening. But in the beginning, it was just so much to learn and get better at. And the knowledge that the kids are going to be there every single day waiting for you. So you can't be like, hey, can we push this back to next week? It's there. And it's like, you have to be ready for the moment.
Yeah, the show must go on. And I imagine, at least just remembering my own experience, that high schoolers tend to be the most forgiving and gracious and gentle, crowd that you could possibly be, fumbling in front of.
Man, my favorite would be I would have thrown something together fast and they'd be like, did you even make these slides? And I'm like, I swear I did. I just forgot what it says. They'd be like, did you even come up with this? I was like, oh God.
Oh, yikes. If there's somebody out there who sees themselves in you and sees their own desire to consider Teach for America, or to kind of go down the path of teaching as a profession, do you have any advice for them, or anything that you might be able to share that would help them make what is a very challenging adjustment and a challenging transition maybe a little bit more easy?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is ask for help. Like, I had just been used to figuring things out on my own. Like, oh, okay, this is hard. If I spend a little extra time, I can teach myself. I probably know better. I have my own way of doing things. I'm the best person. With teaching, it's just absolutely not worth it. There's so many people who have already done it, even in your own school building. It took me a long time to build a relationship with older teachers. I should have done that much sooner. and they're very willing to help. We're all teaching the same kids. So I think it's all very overwhelming. Some things you just have to learn on your own, but there's no reason to feel like you have to figure everything out on your own. So just kind of like build relationships with other people doing the job, ask for help, lean on each other. Ultimately, it's a cool opportunity to build a really strong community. Like you collaborate with coworkers, maybe a little more than in some other jobs, but it's just a matter of like, are you going to be the person that closes your door and sits in there and figures it out? Or are you the person that's like door open, going to the teacher's lounge, hanging out with people, building relationships, and ultimately like helping each other out? I think that makes all the difference.
What did you learn about yourself in that Teach for America experience?
I learned a lot about myself from TFA. I think one of the bigger path changing things was building a lot of confidence about speaking and interacting with people. Like I had previously, I think, especially being an engineer, I didn't even have a lot of experience doing a lot of public speaking or, a lot of collaborating with others. And so I kind of assumed my strength or the thing I liked the most was just working on stuff on my own, sitting at my computer, figuring it out. But I actually got a ton of energy. I built a lot of confidence and I got a ton of energy out of facilitating or, interacting with students on a daily basis and doing a lot of relational work. It was much more relational than it was, sitting at my desk. And I don't even think I had a chance to explore that before. That really put on my radar like a different set of roles that maybe are less individual contributor and more like leadership or external facing, strategic. So I just never had exposure to that as an engineer, and especially not in a research PhD kind of program. That was maybe my biggest takeaway.
Let's talk a little bit about your inflection point. And I think most people in their careers will have a moment where they start to find where they want to be and they start to get that reinforcement that they are in the right place, they're doing the right work, they've found their calling per se. What was your inflection point like?
I finished Teach for America and was very confused. It was kind of felt that teaching wasn't the thing I wanted to do forever, but I also felt that going right back into engineering was so disconnected at that point. I was very unsure. I ended up finding a middle ground. I guess you could say it was a middle ground. I took a job back in California with a Microsoft program that was trying to get high school computer science classes started. And so that was a role where I was connected to tech and some of that computer science knowledge was helpful, but I was also working with schools, supporting teachers, things like that. I thought that was a perfect fit. And when I was doing that job, I felt a really strong disconnect being away from rural communities. I didn't expect it to be so jarring, but it was like even though we're talking about equity in schools and access to computer science and all these barriers, very rarely was the urban rural gap coming into the conversation. And even more rarely, when it was coming in, people weren't talking about the rural South. And after a while, it just wore on me. Like, I just started to wonder, like, do people in these rooms even realize that there are communities like the one that I had taught in that have tremendous assets, tons of kids, and families who are eager to learn and do stuff. And none of us are even thinking about how to get them access to this type of skill, computer science, or even, internet access and devices and stuff. That really wore on me. And I think around then is when I started to realize that maybe whatever future career path I was heading towards would need to be connected back with the rural communities that I had taught in or similar. It took a little longer, I think, to connect those dots, but I just remember that dissonance. I stayed in that job for about 2 years, maybe a little less, but towards the end, it was almost like constant. Like I just felt like I can't do this forever and I need to figure out a way to not necessarily go back to Eastern North Carolina, but do work that honors and is connected to communities like that one.
What a beautiful thing. I think that gives us a very nice segue to talk about ROI, the Rural Opportunity Institute. Would you tell us a little bit about you and your co-founder and how you approached building the ROI?
It's kind of a funny story. My co-founder, Seth, at ROI. He also did Teach for America. He was a year behind me, but we overlapped for a year. And the way we met actually was at the very end of my second. TFA is a 2-year program, so at the end of my second year of teaching, there was a startup weekend in Raleigh, which is maybe an hour from where we were teaching. And it was focused on education. And so I'd never been to a startup weekend. They're kind of these 54-hour sprinty hackathon things focused on a theme where you try to meet people and come up with a startup idea you want to pitch. Had never been. Me and a bunch of teacher friends were like, let's check it out. Went for a weekend. Seth was also there. I'd never met him before. And Seth ended up being on the winning team. And I don't think my team was even, I was on a team that didn't do very well. But I heard him pitch and stuff, and then we caught up after, and there was just like a lot of alignment. He was very entrepreneurial and was interested in kind of thinking about, different ways to create solutions in the classroom. A lot of what he was saying resonated with me, and he was coming back for another year to teach, and I had already accepted that Microsoft job. And interestingly enough, the thing that he had pitched at Startup Weekend was some sort of coding thing. So he was very interested in the job I was doing. He's like, hey, let's stay in touch. I want to know more about this, Teals thing and whatever you end up figuring out. So I was like, yeah, sure. So I'm in California working on this program, and he reaches out to me and he's like, is there any way we can use your coding program in my high school? And I'm like, I don't know, let me ask. And it turned out we were piloting this thing where you could, like, normally the way the program worked is we would train teachers physically in schools. So we'd find a science teacher, maybe they'd say, hey, I want to learn coding. We'd hook them up with some Microsoft volunteers who'd help them at a computer coding class. There's no Microsoft volunteers in rural Eastern North Carolina. So it's like, okay, how do we do that? They were piloting a remote thing where Microsoft engineers could Zoom into, I guess it wouldn't have been Zoom at the time, it's probably Skype, could Skype into a high school classroom in a rural place and coach the teacher remotely, and they would offer this class. So I was like, well, do we want to try that? He was really into it. So Seth figured out everything on his end to make it possible. And they actually were one of 2, I think, rural pilot schools that we had doing that program. That was probably, when I was saying that the work we were doing was super disconnected, that was probably like the one area of connection. My hope would have been that grew into a huge thing. It didn't really, but he and I stayed connected through that class. And it was really neat to just have a window into Eastern North Carolina still, even though I was over there. So I ended up connecting with him quite a lot at the time, just, hearing how things are going. And then he, at the end of his second year of teaching, his now wife got a job in California. And so he moved to Oakland, and I was living in San Francisco. So he hits me up like, I'm living nearby now. He's still teaching. And we started meeting up regularly. And Seth is funny. Seth is very intentional about relationship building. So we'd meet up and he'd say, okay, let's do 1 hour where we talk about business ideas and 1 hour where we hang out as friends. And so we'd meet up and have these structured times or whatever. And it was pretty cool. I think those regular 1 hours to talk about business ideas really started to pull some common themes out. And then the 1 hour talking with friends, it was like, well, we actually have a lot of compatibility. We have a lot of shared values. It could be a good, I don't know that I was explicitly searching for a co-founder, but in some ways it was kind of a process of thinking through okay, if I was going to start something with somebody, would we be able to do it? So we were building this relationship and also, talking about ideas. And I had this one person in California who had the same shared experience. And I think that gave me a lot of energy. And so basically we continued to talk, and we had a lot of bad ideas before we had a good one, but we were very interested in supporting kids outside of the classroom. We were very interested in early childhood education. People in the Bay were starting to talk about this idea of trauma and the way that challenging events can impact the nervous system. And there was starting to be this discussion about, trauma-informed classrooms and understanding that what we might view as a behavior problem or a developmental delay is actually like kids dealing with a high level of stress. And so our response needs to be different. That narrative was happening in the Bay. It wasn't really happening in Eastern North Carolina. We got curious about what would it look like to implement some of those things in rural. So I think for like 6 months to a year, we were very enamored by all the lean startup. We were like, oh, let's be the Mark Zuckerbergs of education. And so we would like go online and download these different tools that help with early childhood development and put them into a little kit. And then we were finding all these parent groups and saying, hey, can we come in and show parents the stuff we came up with? And we'd get feedback, and most of the time they'd be like, you guys clearly aren't parents because this would never work. Like one thing I remember is the kit, the different games that we had were inside a Ziploc bag. And the parents were like, yo, you cannot bring that Ziploc bag near my kid. That's choking hazard. And we were like,
wow.
oh,
Yikes.
Didn't think of that. Or like one time we made this little book, but it was stapled. They were like, I don't want my kid near staples. So we were learning a lot. I mean, just learning a lot about how to create products for people. No good ideas, but very fun times. And I think through all that, it solidified our working relationship. At some point, we had spent enough of our own money and time on this without hitting anything that we took a break. But, I ended up leaving my job, went to business school, was hoping to just like change paths. But I stayed in touch with Seth through all of that. And it was kind of over the years that we got clearer and clearer about what a business might look like that would actually be successful. And so, 2017, we raised some money to come back to Eastern North Carolina, originally just to start out as a research project. It was just like let's spend a couple of months getting to know people and figuring out what is needed. And that is what ultimately turned into ROI. I think one of the bigger things we had learned was like, you got to take the time to get to know people. You can't just think of ideas at home and sell them. So yeah, it was like several years kind of us building that relationship before we got to the thing that actually took off.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. We'll get back to the conversation shortly, but I wanted to tell you about how I can help you find your fit. I offer one-on-one career coaching services for experienced professionals who are preparing to find and land their next role. If you're a director, vice president, or a C-suite executive, and you're ready to explore new opportunities, please go to goodfitcareers.com to apply for a free consultation. I also occasionally send a newsletter which includes stories from professionals who have found their fit, strategies and insights that might be helpful in your job search, and content that I found particularly useful or interesting. If you'd like to learn more, check out goodfitcareers.com and follow me on LinkedIn. Now, back to the conversation. Before we dive into what the business is, what the not-for-profit looks like, how you've structured the organization, would you help give us a few definitions, some of the key terms that we're going to go through in terms of how to frame the work that you're doing, just to make sure that the audience can follow us along?
I think when we're talking about trauma or generational trauma, there's a lot of definitions out there. We're a little broad about it, but it's basically any sort of event or thing that happens that creates a feeling of stress that is, a lot of times what they say is too much, too fast. And so you can experience a lot of regular stress that our bodies and nervous systems are able to navigate. Like you find out you miss a deadline, or you slept through your alarm. That's stressful stuff, but it's over quickly. We're able to recover. There's another level of stressful thing, which could be more like experiencing homelessness or domestic violence or flooding from a natural disaster. Those kinds of things. In other countries, very often it's like being close to or near a conflict zone. That is like too much for too long. That's not over quick. It's very overwhelming. And those types of stresses they leave a lasting mark on your nervous system. And so it actually changes how your body physically handles stress in the future. Often it leads to people being on higher alert, more sensitive to certain things. And so the lasting outcome is that you could then be in a situation that isn't actually stressful, but your body feels like it is. And so it's like constantly in a fight or flight mode. Doing that has behavioral implications. You might be, quicker to get angry or run away or be stressed, but it also has physiological implications. So our nervous system being on higher alert like that can tax our organs, can lead you to be more likely to have heart conditions earlier. It can lead to more difficulty with metabolism, digestion, all these different things. So there have been studies that have shown that trauma, especially in early years, is correlated with a whole host of long-term health outcomes, and unfortunately also like economic and educational ones because of that behavioral aspect.
Now, bring us along to the business, the ROI as it stands. Would you tell us a little bit about where you fit within the company and what your team looks like, please?
Yeah, so I am one of the co-founders of ROI along with Seth. He and I still are the co-leaders of the organization, so we've been running it for about 7 years. Currently are a full-time team of 4. He and I were the only 2 employees for about 4 years. And then we were able to bring on one full-time director of operations who's still with us. So she's the best. And then about a year ago, hired another director of programs and innovation. And so right now it's the 4 of us, and Seth and I do probably a lot more now of the like strategic and administrative support functions. So we're doing a lot of like raising money, hiring people, thinking through like what are the next projects we want to take on, building partnerships, stuff like that. And then Naomi and Graham, our 2 employees, are doing a lot more of the day-to-day on the ground, running projects, running operations, going locally to meet with folks and keep a lot of things going. So our roles have kind of transitioned a little bit over the years, but currently that's a lot of where I'm at.
Tell us a little bit about some of the initiatives or some of the broader projects that you guys are working on.
When Seth and I first started ROI, we came in with this idea of we want to help students and families experience more success, starting out in classrooms, but also just in general. But we actually aren't sure what support is needed. And so I think over years of trying and failing, we built a fair amount of humility about, we got to understand this. And so we spent that first year just talking to people, did a ton of interviews with a lot of parents, a lot of kids, a lot of support staff, teachers, nurses, police, things like that. And we heard very consistently, people weren't using these words, but we heard very consistently these stories of trauma. And, parents might tell a story like, I'm a single parent. I left my partner due to domestic violence. I had a little kid. For a little while, we were homeless in a car. And during that time, my son started demonstrating signs of, stress and erratic behavior in school. He's acting the way any 3 or 4-year-old would if they were living out of their car, but that school labeled that as ADHD. So we put him on medication. He wasn't responding to it, so they kept upping the dose. I mean, in reality, he didn't have ADHD, but the school is starting to see that as like, this kid is a behavior problem. No matter what we do, he's still acting out. So, when you're 3 and 4, it's one thing. As he gets into kindergarten and first grade, they start suspending him from school. And so, this mom that we're talking to, by then she's like, I've gotten a job as a nurse. We've moved into a stable home, but my kid's already been labeled. And as he experiences more and more of those examples of being sent out of class, he also starts to kind of lose trust in the system. And so she's kind of struggling with that. And then the school finally says, when you get a little bit older, they say, hey, if the parent needs to come in for a hearing to deal with this. And that is during the workday. So this mom is saying, well, I can't take time off work. I need to negotiate with my job. But if I don't take time off, then my son might end up expelled or sent to some sort of alternative program or, labeled on some other track. But if she does take time off to go, she might lose her job. And that puts them back into this cycle of disruption. So that story is one of a ton of stories like that we were hearing. And it's like, people are really hoping for support from the schools or their job or the police or social services. But what ends up happening is all of those systems are not equipped. We have biases. We don't understand what's going on. And so we end up making things worse for people. And then it just builds. The school becomes overwhelmed with these situations. Employers are saying, I don't know, we can't, we're having a hard time with people who have to keep taking off work. social services and police are saying we have all these disruptions we have to respond to. The whole system is overwhelmed because of this trauma. And none of us know how to deal with it. That was the big takeaway. And we shared that out with some different community groups, those findings. And in a positive, maybe even surprise, a lot of different systems leaders across those, exact stakeholders, schools, police, health, we're all kind of saying, yeah, you're right. How do we deal with this better? And that was kind of the switch to like what ROI does now. So we were able to take that initial input and momentum to raise some additional funds. And since then, what we've been doing is working with these different agencies to help them understand how's trauma showing up for them and what are ways they can respond better. So that might look like doing trainings for staff. That's usually the starting point. But then we can also think about implementing some actual practices. We might be able to say, okay, in a different area, here's an example of a school that switched away from suspending kids to this alternative way of responding. And, if that seems like a good fit, we'll then help the school implement something like that, walk alongside them for a little while, measure the data, adapt, and stuff like that. So there's a handful. We've probably worked with about 20 organizations to date to pilot and design some of these different interventions. That's basically our process, is kind of understanding where the trauma is showing up and then building the capacity of agencies to respond differently.
What have you found actually makes a difference and what actually works?
Yeah, it's healing from trauma is actually surprisingly, it's not easy, but it's somewhat simple in terms of the basic concepts. So what it is at the end of the day is traumatic events are creating a burden on our nervous system. And somebody said this to us very early in the work, and I think it took me years and years to really understand what they meant. But they were like, the basis of healing from trauma is safety and connection. It's like in any moment, people need to convince their nervous system that they're safe. And one of the main ways humans do that is by having a connection with somebody in the moment. And so at the basis of a lot of the things we're doing, it's figuring out how to downregulate someone's nervous system so that they feel safe, and then giving them a connection to usually an adult that they can trust to work through what happens next. And so for an example of what we're talking about here, we work a lot with schools. And one of the most common responses to stress and trauma in classrooms is to send somebody out of the classroom. And so like a kid might be, they might have experienced something very difficult in the morning, and they're coming in stressed, and then they're trying to do their work and they mess up and a teacher yells at them. And that might be it. That might be enough to kind of set them off, and maybe they yell back. And the teacher says, all right, you need to go down the hall. You've been sent out. And so the kid is out of class. In that moment, they don't feel safe because of whatever just happened, and they've just been isolated. So when you get sent out, you are disconnected. And so those two things can really set their people's nervous system off into this fight or flight. Like, how do I recover from this? That often leads to these like escalating behavior problems. So what we were able to implement in a middle school was we set up this separate room with a staff member whose like whole job basically is, instead of being discipline, it's more like restorative justice, but their whole job is kind of to like support students through this moment. And they have this classroom, and it has a bunch of tools in it that can help with self-regulation. And one of them is this technology called biofeedback. It's actually used a lot in military and athletes and stuff. And like if anybody uses the Whoop tracker or the Aura ring, like those are all examples of biofeedback where it's in the moment measuring your nervous system, and it's telling you, are you good to work out today? Do you need to take some more rest? So there are these devices that you can get that can, in the moment, measure the state of your nervous system and then tell you, maybe some exercises you can do, walk you through some breathing or things like that. And so we got some of those devices in that classroom. So when a kid gets sent out, and they know this ahead of time, when a kid gets sent out, now they're going to that room. And so immediately the first thing they have is a connection. There's an adult there who didn't send them out and who has no interest in punishing them. And that person is someone they can build a relationship with. And then they have these tools where they can, sit down quietly, pop in a little biofeedback device, take a look at an app, look at some soothing colors, do some breathing exercises, and they can stay there as long as they need to. Usually only takes like 10 or 15 minutes. The room might have some comfortable chairs, calm lighting, maybe a couple of, fidgety things that you can move with your hands. All of that are things that regulate our nervous system. And they're doing that with a trusted person. Spend 10 to 15 minutes in that room. Usually kids would themselves say at some point, okay, I'm good. I can go back. And when they're ready, they, pop their biofeedback stuff off. They head back over, sit down, jump back in. And the alternative is like we send them out. Now they're getting yelled at by the principal. Their parent is being called. The whole thing is like more and more and more and more stressful. And they are becoming disconnected from all these adults because they don't feel safe. And so it's different in different scenarios, but at the end of the day, it's like, where are people feeling, stressed out and unsafe? And how can we give them a moment to regulate and build a connection? And that pretty much, if you do that repeatedly, it retrains our nervous system to realize that some of those situations that seem stressful are actually very safe and we can work through them.
Wow, that is fascinating. And I think such a contrast to, at least in my experience growing up in the United States in kind of the public school education system, so contrary to what it used to look like. I'm so glad that there are people like you who are figuring this out and finding a way to make this better. That's such a wonderful thing. To take a step back and think beyond just the tactical or strategic day-to-day work, let's think a little bit more philosophically. What does your work mean to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think something I was searching for a long time in my career was a kind of personal connection to the work. And, for a while, it was thinking about, building products that are in people's hands so I can see how they're using it. But I think even more than that, I was looking for a relational connection to the work. And so one of the things that's been really powerful about working in rural Eastern North Carolina in a specific community for so long is I have a lot of personal relationships with the people and the places that we work in. So it's not just about working with the school or a police department to do a program. It's like I personally know the police chief. I personally know a lot of the teachers. I know some of the students and families. And I'm not only seeing in the data the outcomes of the work that we're doing, but I'm seeing it through actual personal stories. So there's kids now that have, for example, the biofeedback restorative program in a middle school. I know kids who were there when that happened who are now in college. And I can kind of see and feel and hear about, what that meant and how they have, in many cases, they have become advocates for trauma-informed practices wherever they are. In the beginning, it was like, oh, this is cool. Let's see if we can make something happen here. But over the years, it's built into this very personal experience where I feel like I'm not a person running a business in the community. I'm a community member and we're all doing this thing together.
I'm so glad the world has people like you and that you found the people that need your help. That's tremendous. For anybody out there who is interested in helping and contributing and building those personal relationships with the people that they want to serve, and maybe it's through a startup or maybe it's through joining a startup, do you have any advice or a lesson for them that might be helpful as they consider embarking on this journey and then perhaps as they try to make it real?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big things I learned over the course of, as I early on when Seth and I had a lot of bad ideas and then coming to where we are now, I definitely learned the value of you can't sit in a room with your door closed and think forever to get to a solution that works. It's like you got to get out and hear from people what their experiences are, riff with them about what might work. And it's like over time, collectively, you'll get to a solution. That sounds simple. And then the first thing that comes to mind is okay, so how do I do that? And I was stuck in that for a long time too. Of I get it. I get that you're supposed to get out of the building, but what am I doing? And I found a lot of support around these proven methodologies that give you tools and processes for doing that. So one of the big ones that I've used a couple times and now we follow pretty closely at ROI is all of the human-centered design and design thinking methodologies. And so you can like, in my case, I learned a lot of this from IDEO and they have a lot of their stuff open online, but there's some other Stanford D School has some stuff. There's some other, examples of people that have open tools, but it's basically a set of steps you can follow to start to systematically get input from people. And, they have little interview guides so you can think through the questions that you need to ask people. They have activities you can do with people to help get feedback in a different way. And so for me, it's like very intimidating to say to a parent or a person that I don't know, can I talk to you for a few minutes? And then I'm making up what I'm asking. But in this case, it gives you like a little bit of legitimacy. It's like, hey, I want to learn more about your experience. Can we sit down for 30 minutes? I have some activities I want to do with you. And then they're like, oh, okay, cool. And then you go and you're not making it up. Like you can pull the activities they have, you tailor it for what you're trying to learn, you do it. They have processes for, once you get all this input, what do you do? And there's some systematic ways to, pull out themes, identify what's bubbling up, and then move from that to like the brainstorming of solutions. And it actually, like with all those processes, doesn't take very long and is a great way to build relationships with people. And so for me, it was like I needed a tool or something to follow. And I found it in human-centered design. I think there's other methodologies as well, but it's just like, I think of it as almost like a group project. Like it's like, okay, we have this assignment. We need to talk to 5 people and do this interview. Great. Let me like get to work on that. That makes it a lot less intimidating. And it's like once you're out there doing it, you just get more and more confident. You might talk to somebody and then they're like, hey, I have 2 friends you should talk to. And so it all kind of builds on itself. But just to get started, I think drawing from some of those existing methodologies can make it a lot easier.
Fantastic. Well, wonderful advice. How do you believe the world sees your job as a co-founder for a not-for-profit?
It's interesting. I think so in my current role, there's a couple of different hats. There's this co-founder of a startup identity, and then there's the nonprofit part. And I think there's a lot of messy stuff in there about how I'm perceived. And so if I lead with co-founding a startup, I think people think of that as very brave, very cool. They're like, oh, wow, that's awesome. That is really put on a pedestal. Like if you are somebody that started a company, that comes with all this good stuff. But there's an interesting expectation that like, oh, you're going to make a lot of money, right? You're going to grow really fast, make a lot of money. And I think if you say, I'm running a nonprofit, it has a totally different set of perceptions where people are like, oh, I'm assuming you don't make any money and you are a very giving, generous person who's sacrificing a lot to do this like very hard, needed, but maybe not super cool work. And people often aspire to be the startup founder and they're like, oh, I want to talk to you to learn how you did it. But for the nonprofit part, they're like, oh, that's cool. I don't think I want me or my kids doing that, but good job. And so I struggle a lot because I think it's very like we need to be more realistic about all the range of what nonprofit work is. And like just because it's nonprofit doesn't mean that you're just sacrificing. It doesn't mean that you can't earn any money. It certainly doesn't mean that it's like easier or less prestigious than founding a for-profit company. And I feel like for me, it's like, that's the thing I'm always running up against is depending on how I frame it, I get really different responses. And I find that the for-profit startup path is just valued so much higher. It's considered more prestigious than the nonprofit part. But I very intentionally moved away from that tech startup kind of world. And so I don't necessarily want to be associated with that, but it's a challenge because people just, depending on what they hear, it's like they immediately assume different things. And it's pretty hard to find the nuance between like these things can intersect and here's what it means. And that is not very mainstream, I think, in people's minds.
I really appreciate your reflectiveness on that. I think seeing the contrast, having the duality between, part of your title and then part of your company, and seeing how we as a broader society perceive those things, I think that's very fascinating. And I think if we were to give somebody the question, like what's more important for the world, right? Doing not-for-profit work or, making a bunch of money in a high-tech startup. I think the test question, people would say, oh, absolutely, not-for-profit work, right? That's really what matters. But then at the end of the day, our actions and what we actually see tend to be a little bit different. Tell us a little bit about you. You've hired 2 people for your team, and I'd love to learn a little bit about how you approached finding, evaluating, and hiring your team members.
Yeah, hiring is super hard. And for kind of additional context, we've hired 2 people right now that are our 2 employees. We have gone through a few other hiring processes with folks who are either on for less time or it didn't quite work out. So right now I feel like we have a solid team in place, but I don't feel like we've mastered hiring at all. It's like feels like we got a little bit lucky. But I mean, it's a hard thing. So especially in the position that we're in, because we're trying to hire for a small organization that's a startup. It's also a nonprofit. It's also based in a rural place. And so you're looking not just for people who have the skills, but also people who are willing to do that kind of work. And in some cases, that is going to come with some trade-offs. We're not going to pay as much as if you were going to a consulting firm, or a big company. We try to create remote work opportunities so you can, live in the Raleigh-Durham area, but you're not going to be able to live in New York City probably. And the work you're doing may not fit into the traditional work experiences people are looking to build early in their career. It's just not at the same scale. I think in a lot of ways it's like tough because we are pretty unapologetic, I think, about getting excellent talent. And personally, I believe that the people that we serve and the community we work in deserve excellent talent. And so we have a pretty high bar in terms of, when we think about the characteristics we're looking for in a candidate, we expect, whatever skill they're coming in with, the skills that are needed. They have some ability to kind of self-manage, they have some work experience, all that stuff. And we realize that in that pool, we're competing with a lot of organizations that are cooler places to work. On average, we're competing with Google and Facebook and McKinsey and Deloitte and all that stuff. And so it's like, I think one of the bigger challenges is like, how do we make ourselves stand out in that pool? And like I said, we've had some success. I think the candidates that we have on board right now really do see the additional value in working for us, whether that is, because we're small, the opportunity to have more autonomy and leadership, the opportunity to be really hands-on in the strategic parts of the organization as well. Like, yes, they might be managing a program, but they're also reporting to the co-founder. And so they're in conversations where, they might not otherwise be if they were working at like Amazon. I think a lot of them see value in the community work and the impact that we're having and building expertise around rural disparities and getting a chance to innovate a lot faster than they might somewhere else. And we try to, one of the harder things is around compensation. I think we try to differentiate ourselves by offering, really generous benefits. We have unlimited vacation. We try to think about, creating flexibility in other ways, giving people access to professional development, sending them to conferences, speaking opportunities. So it's just kind of like the hardest part, I think, is getting a diverse, high caliber applicant pool to then be able to find folks that are the right fit when we're especially like, when the job market is strong, when we're competing with all of these other cool places to work that people might be more likely to want to take a chance on.
Being a bit of the underdog in the hiring space, while there's still meaning and purpose and value to what you're creating, there's still opportunity to do things, far above or greater than you would have done in other size corporations. I imagine that makes accountability and performance management pretty tricky. Can you teach us a little bit about how you approach accountability and performance management in the not-for-profit space?
Yeah, it's a hard problem. So actually when we first started and we first started hiring, I think we had a little bit of a hesitation to set really high performance standards. I think we were almost operating in a way that maybe a lot of people see the nonprofit field, where it's like, listen, if somebody's willing to work for you and they're trying hard, you can't really expect a super high level of performance, or you have to be very forgiving. You got to give people a million chances because, it's nonprofit. And I think early on we fell into that a little bit, maybe even unintentionally. And what it created was a culture where it was like, hey, if you gave it a good try, that's good enough. And, Seth and Vici are never going to actually hold anyone accountable. They're they're very forgiving. They understand all the time. And it's not like people were intentionally taking advantage of us, but it creates this culture of like, I could put in that extra bit to make this really solid, but it's fine. I'll just submit what I have. And it took us a while to see that. But I think our initial operating we hold ourselves to a super high standard, but it was almost like we can't expect that of anyone else. And more recently, particularly, I think with some of the leadership of our recent hires, like our director of operations, we have people coming from previous work experiences that were very rigorous. They bring with them some of the things they've learned. And I think now we've started to put into place, like, what does actual accountability look like? So we've started to, look at performance reviews and people setting goals and reflecting on that and feedback. And there's like a part of that I don't like. I don't think we want to get super into the like, there's all kinds of evaluation and people are always being evaluated and everybody's scared of being fired. Like, that's a direction we don't want to go in, but we do want to be able to set really high goals and then be honest about it. Like, are we meeting them or not? Let's have an honest conversation about that and hold the expectation high. So we're still working on putting those systems into place. The folks we have on board right now are very open to that and bring some past experience in work environments like that. But it's hard to find the sweet spot of like, we want to hold people accountable and we want to provide the support for people to grow. We don't want to become a place where everyone's just scared of being fired and trying to like cover themselves constantly. So what's that middle ground? That's like tricky to figure out.
And setting the course for the company culture, setting the standard for, what is acceptable, what is outstanding, what is unacceptable, and holding people to that. I feel like that's one of the biggest challenges in any company, in any profession, today. As we bring this conversation to a close, I want to switch gears a little bit and think about kind of three categories, right? The first is going to be the future. The second is what you think your field's going to look like in 2030. And the third is how you like to waste time. So in terms of the first one there, tell me a little bit about what you're most excited about for the future at a macro level.
I think for the future at a macro level, a shift I'm seeing, well, particularly among younger folks, like, a lot of people like to hate on Gen Z, but I'm seeing like a really positive shift among younger folks of rejecting the way we have always thought about work and employment and labor and, our relationship to society. And I am excited about seeing how that plays out. Like, I already enjoy being pushed by some of the younger folks we hire on, how we run our company, but also just like how we relate. It used to be not okay to come to work and talk about how you're feeling or what might be going on. And it's like people are bringing that and it makes me feel uncomfortable, but I think that's positive. Like, I'm excited to see how our whole society gets pushed towards like more meaningfully connecting with each other, more meaningfully bringing our full selves and not just being obsessed with productivity and being busy and all that stuff. It's like, what's a more holistic version of how we live life? So I'm very hopeful that our generation, but also those younger than us, can really make that shift across work and life.
Mm-hmm. To think through the future in your field specifically, it is July of 2024 when we're recording this. We're just about 5.5 years away from being in 2030, which kind of blows my mind. Would you tell me a little bit about what you think your field is actually going to look like in 2030?
Yeah, I am sensing some shifts already in the kind of social innovation, social entrepreneurship field. I mean, I've been doing this last 10 to 12 years or so, and I already see a lot of shifts in terms of putting support behind folks who are living and experiencing challenges to be in the positions to be able to solve those challenges. My hope is that by 2030, we just have way more of that. Like if you were to zoom out and look at the landscape of social entrepreneurs, social innovation, nonprofits, that you would see way more of the folks in leadership and on boards and things like that being from the communities that the work is being done for. And adjacent to that, I also am very optimistic and hopeful about shifts in philanthropy. Like I'm already seeing a lot more funders think about, who's on their boards, who are they giving their money to, what do their, can they be more flexible about the type of funding they offer and what they're expecting from grantees. And so I'm also hopeful that by 2030 we see, way more community representation on foundation boards, a lot more money going directly to entrepreneurs who are from communities, and maybe they don't have the same degrees and qualifications and credentials, but they have lived experience. So just elevating a lot more of those leaders and giving them the same access to social capital, networks, resources that a lot of us currently in the field have.
It sounds like a bright future. How do you like to waste time?
I love to waste time. I'd say some of the favorites. I mean, I have gotten really into, so some backstory. About a year ago, I tore my Achilles tendon. Really tough injury. And it's a long recovery. So it's only been in the last couple of months that I feel like I'm like fully recovered. But in that whole experience, got to really think about like how I was spending all my downtime. And I think now it's like I have a ton of personal value and excitement around just like sweating, like being active and sweating. And so my most recent kind of fun thing to do has been these boxing classes. And so it's not like fighting people that's very stressful, but just like going to a gym and like punching a bag and doing that for an hour and getting really sweaty, like that hour goes by super fast and it's like I forget everything. So yeah, just enjoy like getting out of my head and finding a way to sweat, which currently is boxing, but open to other stuff.
That sounds very far from wasted time to me, but I'm glad you're finding a new pursuit you enjoy. In terms of the way that people can help you and the way that the people out there, if they're inspired by your story, if they're excited about the work that ROI is doing, what's the best way for them to get involved or to help?
Yeah. Quickest way to learn about ROI is to our website, which is just www.ruralopportunity.org. You can read a lot about our programs there. We also are on Instagram and LinkedIn. And then my email is just vichi@ruralopportunity.org. So also happy to talk to anyone directly.
Great. We'll put all those in the show notes. Vichi, thank you so very much for joining me and sharing your perspective.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was fun.
Our next episode is with Ankit Sethi, Enterprise Account Executive with Alphabet's Google Cloud Platform.
We think about this giant machine of Google, but there are these people behind it who are just so fantastic to work with.
If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe for new episodes, leave a review, and tell a friend. Good Fit Careers is hosted by me, Ryan Dickerson, and is produced and edited by Mellow Vox Productions. Marketing is by Story Angled, and our theme music is by Surftronica, with additional music from Andrew Esperanceta. I'd like to express my gratitude to all of our guests for sharing their time, stories, and perspectives with us. And finally, thank you to all of our listeners. If you have any recommendations on future guests, questions, or comments, please send us an email at hello@goodfitcareers.com.